Welcome to the Spot On Insurance podcast, brought to you by Insurance Licensing Services of America, ILSA. This is Arlene Tavares.
And this is Ted Tavares coming to you from Puerto Rico. In this episode, we'll be getting insight from one of the top regulatory attorneys in our industry.
But before we begin, remember to click on the subscribe button so you don't miss a single episode. And now here's our host, Doug Foresta.
Hello and welcome to Spot On Insurance. This is your host, Doug Foresta. Today, my guest is Peter Thrane from Stinson Leonard Street in Minneapolis. Today, we're going to be talking about things that insurance producers need to think about when interacting with regulators. Peter, first of all, thank you so much for joining me. And before we begin, if you could just give our listeners a little bit of a history about your background, how long you've been interacting with regulators.
I've worked with and represented insurers, producers, and a range of insurance businesses before state insurance regulators for almost 30 years. More recently, my work is focused on Minnesota, but over the course of my career, I've handled matters in 32 states. I started working in the insurance industry for the St. Paul companies. I've now been in private practice for about 15 years. So in the course of that time in those states, I've handled the whole range of things: licensing issues, enforcement matters, transactional issues, product filing and approval, legislative initiatives, you name it. If it's a matter that's been considered by a state insurance regulator, I've likely dealt with it at some point with some regulator somewhere.
I know that we take for granted that insurance is heavily regulated, but if I'm an agent, what does that mean for me?
I'll tell you what, it is easy to forget in the course of our everyday life that we are in an incredibly regulated business, one that really involves every aspect of the law. If you think about it, we sell a legal contract that's subject to rate form and marketing requirements under a whole process that's regulated by state law, with any disputes adjudicated by the courts. We are all about the law and regulation. And so when we do that business, you need to step back and appreciate that all of these transactions are subject to law and subject to heavy regulation. As you know, agents are regulated in every state in which they sell, solicit, or negotiate insurance. And those are all defined terms, and we can go in the state statutes and look them up, but I think agents generally have a context for, if you sell, solicit, or negotiate insurance in a particular state, whether you're within the borders of that state, but you're dealing with the consumer in that state, then we have a great deal of regulation that applies. There's licensing of the agent, and there's substantive regulation over how the product is sold, sometimes varying widely by state. It's important to keep in mind that when a producer applies for and accepts an insurance agency license, the agent agrees to the jurisdiction of that state. If an agent agrees to be licensed, has a non-resident producer license in Alaska, they agree, if necessary, to present themselves in Alaska to deal with that regulator. They agree to provide information to the Alaska Department of Insurance if there's questions. And so by accepting a license, an agent accepts the jurisdiction of that state regulation, and they also accept the substance of the regulation over their transaction. So keep in mind, though, and here's the practicality of it. Insurance regulators are fundamentally about making sure insurers honor their promises. Fundamentally, that is, on the one hand, making sure insurance companies are solvent, but also it's sort of addressing the complaints of consumers. So when consumers complain to regulators about a particular product or transaction or claim or promise, the regulators often turn to the agent to explain what happened. And keep in mind, they start that conversation talking to the agent with a bit of a skepticism, tending to accept the consumer's position.
What is your general approach for dealing with state regulators?
My general view is, and this is one honed over time, I almost always think that full disclosure and transparency is your best strategy in dealing with a regulator. Keep in mind, when an agent accepts a license, they accept the jurisdiction of that state, and included in the jurisdiction of that state is the requirement to provide whatever information the regulator wants. And so if you start from the premise that a regulator has the authority to obtain most any record or information or topic that an agent may possess, if the regulator has the right to get that, it's probably best to deal with them in a transparent fashion, simply because they're going to have the right to get the information at some point. So dealing with them in a direct and transparent way allows the agent or the person being subject to regulation, to shape the answer to a particular question. If you have a bad piece of information, they're going to have a right to get it. Better to provide it in a forthcoming way so you can at least shape and characterize it and put it in context. The thing you have to keep in mind, Doug, is that regulators have a huge volume of work. I mean, I once had a boss who characterized it by saying it is a huge ocean and the regulators have a very small navy. And what they want to do is they want to solve problems quickly and move on. If a licensee, if a person that's being asked a question by a regulator gets asked a question, helping them solve their problem quickly and helping them move on is the best way to get the regulator out from underneath the business of the licensee. So for that reason, Doug, I tend to think cooperation is the best approach in order to develop and maintain a strong regulatory reputation with your regulators.
Say more about what you mean about regulatory reputation. Can you say a little bit about that?
I tell you, regulators have so many sources to learn about people in the insurance business, particularly insurance agents. Keep in mind that they can go to the internet and find out what they need. They can go to Yelp and find out what they need. The insurance regulatory agencies themselves all report and have databases so that they can access it. So there's really no secrets out there. And so, it's critically important that an agent watches reputation, because a regulator is going to make a very, very quick sort. When the call comes, they have a question on a consumer matter, they've done a quick look at that agent, they're going to have a conversation with that agent, and the regulator is going to make a very quick determination. Is this guy being upfront with me? Is he being straightforward? Does he have expertise in this area? Is this licensee a good guy, or is this licensee a guy I'm going to have problems with? Is he going to be a bad guy? Regulators want to make that sort very, very quickly. You want to be in the good guy column. You don't want to be in the problem column. So I think it's really, really important that agents jealously guard your regulatory reputation. I think that goes back to, when the call comes, cooperation and transparency. Watch what is put out on the web about your agency. If there are enforcement matters that happen, they happen from time to time. Just be aware of them and understand when a regulator calls that you may not have to deal with that.
Thank you. So let's say I'm an agent. I'm doing everything I'm supposed to be doing, but despite that, I get a call from a regulator. I know that there's not just one answer to this, but in general, what should I be thinking about, or what should I do or say when interacting with a regulator?
Regulators tend to call agents for one of two reasons. One reason, and probably the most frequently based call, is something dealing with a license. Is the license current, up to date? Are the CE requirements current and up to date? Is the licensee properly licensed in the jurisdiction where a transaction takes place? Does the licensee have the proper kind of license, category of license to transact that business? That is a huge category of inquiry that may be coming from a state regulator. Oftentimes, though, that kind of inquiry sort of cloaks the more broader inquiry, which is actually sometimes a little more troubling. And that is, if there is a consumer complaint, regulators will call in an enforcement capacity. And sometimes, if you get an email from a regulator, you get a letter from a regulator, they introduce themselves, and they have some sort of word like investigator behind their name, they're calling it in an enforcement capacity. If they have sort of licensing coordinator before their name, they're calling to ask about the status of the license. Depending upon what they're calling upon, I think you want to approach it differently.
Spot on Insurance is sponsored by ILSA, Insurance Licensing Services of America, America's premier insurance licensing experts. To learn more about ILSA and the services they provide, visit ilsainc.com. So I know you mentioned that there's these two general categories, right? One is the agent, one dealing with the agent's licensing status, the other one with enforcement matters. So how would you approach each one then?
So on licensing issues, I think you can quickly answer their question, or if a person's a customer of ILSA, I think you can just refer, if you wish, the regulator to your licensing person at ILSA, or have the ILSA person follow up. That ILSA person will likely know the person that's making the call at least certainly know something about the state, understand what the requirements are. Moreover, they'll have all of your information at their fingertips. So I think that's a particular value of working with insurance licensing services on your licensing. So on licensing issues, I'd work closely with your ILSA representative, and I think they can give you a great hand. On the other hand, enforcement issues can be serious, particularly if the agent is the focus of the enforcement actions. So an enforcement action is often preceded by an information request. You'll get a letter in the mail. You'll get an email. You might get a call. And they'll ask for data, and they'll typically ask for data on a very tight time frame. And so that's something more serious. And that's when you want to think about maybe getting some help.
Well, speaking about help, when should I involve a lawyer, and what type of lawyer should I be looking for?
Well, this is obviously a bit of, sounds like a little self-interest for me, but I tend to think if you're in an enforcement matter, when you ever get a sense that the regulators looking at and taking disciplinary action are looking or investigating your license, for instance, getting a data request, if you get a lawyer involved earlier rather than later, that lawyer then can understand the context of what's happening. They can press the regulator to understand the issues and the story. That gives you a better ability to understand the context and sort of shape your responses and get the thing moving and over as quickly as possible. If I'm looking for a lawyer, I would like to find a lawyer that's got has a reputation, a positive reputation with that regulator, has some experience dealing with people, the agency, knows the area of the law that involves my license, because that guy can be pretty efficient. I tend to find that, a guy that's just sort of a rough and tumble litigator can tend to rub regulators the wrong way, and that's not how you want to start out. You want to start out in a cooperative tone. I know hiring a lawyer can be expensive, particularly an experienced lawyer, but sort of ask yourself, how much is my career worth, and what would I do if I lost my license? And if I'm the subject of an enforcement matter, is it worth it for me to invest in a solution that protects my license, or am I willing to take a risk at losing my license? So I think if you think of it in that context, hiring experienced counsel that's been recommended by perhaps your agents association or call around, I think can be great help.
It sounds like you're saying that regulators don't appreciate an adversarial approach. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, regulators just want to move paper and get things off their desk, solve problems. And a lawyer that's going to put a fight at every step of the way isn't somebody that's helping them solve problems, and they're going to get frustrated. And you just don't want the guy to get frustrated. You don't want that regulator to get frustrated. You want to facilitate their finding out the issue and determining that you don't have an issue, that you've treated your customer right. And the best way to do that is find a lawyer who knows that regulator, perhaps a lawyer with a reputation that you can trade off. If the Department of Commerce or the Department of Insurance that you're working with doesn't know you, hiring a lawyer that they do know allows you to a certain extent to trade off the reputation of that lawyer, which can be very helpful.
If an enforcement matter does target an agent, what is the process of that investigation? Can you take us through that?
An investigation of insurance enforcement matters is not that much different than investigation by any law enforcement agency. And it's important to understand that that's what it is. It's a law enforcement investigation by the government. In this case, investigating whether a licensee followed the applicable law. And so for purposes of that, they will a regulator will ask for information, many times substantial, huge, burdensome amounts of information, review that information, take statements, interview other witnesses, talk to the insurance company involved, deal with complainants, pulling together all this information to develop and reach a conclusion. And typically, if nothing's going to happen, a regulator, you'll never hear from them. On the other hand, if a regulator is going to pursue some discipline, oftentimes they would send a proposed resolution. It would be like in the form of an order or a consent order or a consent decree under which the licensee and the regulator voluntarily agree. And typically that involves an agent saying, I'll do this, I won't do this on a going forward basis, and I'll pay this amount of money. And that's signed and the matter is solved. And keep in mind then, that raises issues in other states. But here's the key point in this, okay? So the key point is that regulators are calling typically prompted by a consumer complaint. What regulators really want to do is satisfy that consumer, close that matter, and move on. So if an agent or a producer can solve the complainant's problem, if they can solve that consumer's problem, the regulator will oftentimes drop the matter or certainly take it at a much lower level of discipline. And so, I think it's often helpful as early as possible to find out what the regulator feels was wrong with the particular consumer and how that can be addressed. And if you can do that, I think you're in a much, much better position. And even though in many cases an agent may feel like, I did it exactly right, the consumer here is not in the right. Sometimes just sort of agreeing to disagree, solving the consumer's problem, and move on solves a regulatory problem.
Let's say that an enforcement matter does end in discipline. How does that impact regulators in other states?
That is a terrific question, Doug. It is, if there's a disciplinary action taken, formal action taken in one state, oftentimes an agent or a company will have to report that incident in other states. There's even circumstances under which if an agent is terminated for cause under certain circumstances, the company that did the agency termination reports that matter to the states in which the agent is licensed. So, there aren't secrets from one state to another. If a consent order is entered into in state X, all the other states will have the ability to know that. In addition, there's sort of an informal NAIC network, and there's some databases under which regulators can go to sort of check on the status of agents. They can look at CIRCON and see what's going on. So if something happens in one state, it's likely to be looked at in other states. And certain states may pick something up and take discipline in their state. So, discipline in one state can sometimes lead to discipline in multiple states. And so it sort of starts a chain reaction.
Well, thank you so much. And to wrap this up, if we had an agent in front of us and you had a couple of words of advice for that agent, what would they be?
Generally know and follow the laws where you operate. Keep good records and respond promptly to your clients. I think it's a pretty good rule of thumb. If you treat your customers well, you will tend not to hear from regulators. I think that's just good business as well.
If people want to reach you, how could they go about doing that? What's the best way for them to learn more about you and to reach out?
Sure. You can go to the website of our law firm, which is Stinson.com. We have 500 lawyers. You can find my name on there, which is Pete Thrane, T as in Tom, H-R-A-N-E. You can see my background on my webpage. I've got some materials posted there. In addition, you could always give me a call at 612-335-1779. My email is pete.thrane, T-H-R-A-N-E, at Stinson.com. And honestly, Doug, I'm just happy to visit with somebody. And if I get a call from somebody that's got a problem in another state, in many cases I'll know somebody that could help them in that state. I'm happy to refer it along. And, I certainly don't need to start the clock until we start doing some real legal work. So I'm happy to talk with anybody, bounce any ideas off, point them in the right direction if that'd be helpful.
Peter Thrane, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Doug.
By the way, our show notes and bonus resources can be found on spotoninsurance.com. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single episode.
Thanks for joining us. And don't forget, we'll be answering this week's podcast questions at Spot On Insurance Facebook Live, Fridays at 11 a.m. Eastern.